Hello, I'm Dr. Victoria Titterington. I'm on the faculty in the College of Criminal Justice at Sam Houston State University. I teach in our Victim Studies program and also work alongside our Law Enforcement Management Institute of Texas. First of all, we'd like to thank the Health Resources Services Administration for this grant, which has funded the Video Education Library, including this two-part program, as well as many other modules that may be of interest to you. So in part one of this two-part program, we gave you an overview of the aging process with some of the implications for law enforcement as you interact with older citizens in your respective communities. In part two, we're going to focus specifically upon elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And by the completion of this module, you'll be able to define those terms as well as the risk factors for elder abuse, victimization, and abuse perpetration. You'll be able to explain basic steps that law enforcement can take to detect and investigate elder abuse, and finally give examples of steps that you can take to strengthen the prosecution of elder abuse cases. And then we'll say just a word about prevention as well when we near the completion of this module. So we showed you this in part one of the two-part program, and it's simply to illustrate the exorbitant and unprecedented growth in the proportion of our population that's actually over age 65 as well as those over age 85. And what you can see is that the growth is significant, and as was explained in our prior program, we actually expect that by the year 2030, about 20%, that is 1 in 5 of every people in the U.S. will be 65 or older. I would also point out that the age 85 and older age group is the fastest growing among this older segment of our population. So I want to acknowledge that substantial content for this program was gained from the National Center on Elder Abuse, as well as a recently published document from the American Bar Association Commission on Law and Aging. And one of the things we'll start with is what can law enforcement do to respond to elders and to elder abuse. We know already that police, sheriff, and other peace officers are often called when safety is endangered or a crime might have occurred. But while mistreatment of elders and adults with disabilities, like other forms of family violence, has traditionally been viewed as a family problem, criminal justice is increasingly adapting to better address elder abuse and neglect when it is in fact a criminal issue. And ways that that can happen include what you're doing now, which is participate in training, this and many, many other options that are available to you, as well as obviously arrest the perpetrators. You may be called on to enforce restraining orders related to elder abuse, as well as performing well-being checks, providing assistance to Adult Protective Services in conducting their investigations, and enhancing prosecution of elder abuse, as well as prevention efforts, as I mentioned earlier. So let's look at the basics: elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation, some definitions, as well as how much of this is actually estimated to be going on in our society today. Well, we take these definitions, there are many out there, but the ones that fairly universally are accepted are those from the National Center on Elder Abuse, and they include physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, exploitation, neglect, and abandonment. It's also important to point out that these frequently co-occur, which is what we know as poly-victimization. So physical abuse, as the name implies or the term implies, inflicting or threatening to inflict, and notice it can be inflicting it or threatening to inflict physical pain or injury to a vulnerable adult. Emotional abuse, sometimes harder to detect or document, but that includes inflicting mental pain or psychological anguish on the person, whereas sexual abuse is any non-consensual sexual contact, coercing an elder to witness sexual behavior or to engage in it themselves. When we define exploitation, we're looking at illegally taking, misusing, or concealing funds or property or assets. In other words, as has been said, if it's not yours, it's stealing. Neglect is defined as refusal or failure by those responsible to provide food or shelter, health care, or protection for a vulnerable adult, and we'll talk about that a little more as we move forward. And then finally, abandonment, the desertion of a vulnerable elder by anyone who's assumed responsibility for their care or custody. So it's important to point out before we move forward that not all harm to elders is intentional. In fact, there are honestly accidents that occur that cause harm to these older persons. We also know that there can be well-intended caregivers who make honest mistakes that cause harm. In some cases, there are persons with physical or psychological disorders that result in their own aggressiveness or their own loss of control, which may render them harmful for an older adult. But the important thing, of course, at this early stage of the game for law enforcement is that ignoring the prospect that elder abuse has occurred can have very dire consequences. It can obviously, the most obvious is that it has potentially dire consequences for the victim's safety, but also the perpetrator's accountability, and in some cases it averts the possibility of developing possible remedies for the problems that are exhibited when you respond to this call for service. So the National Center on Elder Abuse has developed what they call an Elder Justice Roadmap project, and we've taken an excerpt from that for the next portion of our program. What they have done is give us the most currently available estimates of just how much elder abuse or neglect or exploitation is actually occurring. And among the statistics that they cite are that 1 out of every 10 people ages 60 and older who live at home suffer some sort of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, and also that in several small studies, about half the people with dementia were victim to these kinds of abuse and neglect by their caregivers. We know that, and this report indicates that cognitive impairment reduces financial capacity, increasing the risk of financial exploitation. We also know that high rates of neglect, poor care, or preventable adverse events persist in nursing homes and other long-term care settings, and about 2 million older adults live in those at this time. And we're focusing in this program on community-dwelling elders, but certainly important to realize that there are distinct and unique risks that are incurred when someone lives in a skilled nursing facility, nursing home of various kinds. About 2/3 of elder victims are women. African American, Latino, poor, and isolated older adults are disproportionately victimized, and this report also tells us that for every 1 case of elder abuse that comes to light, there's an estimated as many as another 23 that remain hidden. So what are the impacts? Well, they're dire and can literally be deadly. Even modest abuse, research tells us, leads to a 300% higher risk of death when compared to non-abused elders. We also know that significantly higher levels of psychological distress, as I said earlier, which is actually hard to document, but that psychological distress and lower perceived self-efficacy occurs with older adults than those who have not been victimized. There are additional health problems, including increased problems with bone and joint disorders, digestive problems, depression, anxiety, all of these things we've listed, chronic pain, high blood pressure, and heart problems that also come with being victimized as an elder. And it's estimated to add direct medical cost of over $5.3 billion to the nation's annual health expenditures. In turn, the estimated annual financial loss by victims of elder financial exploitation were estimated in 2009 to be about $3 billion, which was a 12% increase from the year 2008. So what are some risk factors for elder abuse? Well, these are among many. These are the primary ones that we wanted to point out to you in this program. We know that elders with dementia are thought to be at greater risk of abuse and exploitation than those of the general elderly population, as I mentioned a minute ago. And risk factors for the population include the caregiver's heightened perception of burden and depressive symptoms, as well as the care recipient's psychological aggression and physical assault behaviors. So there can be factors on both sides of the equation that put them at increased risk. It's also important to acknowledge when we talk about domestic violence grown old that spouses make up a large percentage of elder abusers and that a substantial proportion of these cases are domestic violence that's actually gone on for a long time, and one member of the couple's traditionally tried to exert power and influence or control over the other through various tactics, and those just extend to when that spouse has gotten older and more vulnerable. Okay, so personal problems of the abusers. Well, particularly in the case of adult children, abusers often are dependent on their victims for financial assistance, housing, and other forms of support. So people commonly say, well, it's caregiver stress or it's dependency of the elder on the caregiver, but as we're pointing out here and as research tells us, often it's actually the adult child who may be in that caregiving role who's dependent upon the older person. Oftentimes, they need this support because of personal problems, including mental illness, alcohol or drug abuse, or other dysfunctional personality characteristics. And the risk in these cases is particularly high for elders when these adult children actually live with them. Okay, so on the subject of living, there's research that says living with others can be an increased risk factor as well as social isolation. And these seem to be contradictory findings, but they may turn out to be related in that abusers who live with the elder have more opportunity to abuse and yet may be isolated from the larger community themselves, or may seek to isolate the elders from others so that the abuse is not discovered. And obviously further research needs to be done to explore the relationship between these factors. Physical impairment, as we discussed a little bit in part one, compromises in physical and psychological health as one gets older may also put them at greater risk, as does substance abuse. And I would point out this means substance abuse on the part of the perpetrator or of the victim. So who are the victims? Well, we're talking in this case about people over the age of 65, females more than males, and all socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. And who are the perpetrators? We know that research tells us the vast majority are family members. The largest proportion of that group include adult children, but this also includes abusers who are their spouses, as I mentioned earlier, as well as grandchildren. Unfortunately, the perpetrators may be paid or volunteer caregivers. People are like, you mean you're getting paid for that and then you abuse the person? Well, that's all too common a scenario. Fiduciaries are also perpetrators of these kinds, particularly of financial exploitation, and this can include people who serve as attorneys, guardians, financial advisors, lawyers of other kinds, real estate agents. So all of them are potentially in a position to exploit that elder. Strangers, and by this we use a couple of specific examples that are really serious problems for older adults, and that includes telemarketers as well as people going door to door. And then sadly, friends and neighbors may also be perpetrators. These can be men or women, they can be any age, any race, any socioeconomic status. So what are the risk factors of being a perpetrator? Well, as I cited earlier, dependence on the elder victim for either financial or other support may in fact place you at greater risk of being a perpetrator. In other words, some of the characteristics that put you in this dependent state may also extend themselves to your propensity to abuse or neglect an elder. A history of having done this in the past with an older adult is also a good indication that perpetration may reoccur. Living with the victim, having that proximity and or dependence on them also increases the risk of being an elder abuse perpetrator, as does mental illness or substance abuse. Well, how do abusers justify their behavior? It's important for us to think about at this point, how can they get away with it, or why do they get away with it? And also to ask the opposite question, which is, why do elders allow these things to happen? So let's take the first of those. How do abusers justify their behavior? Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe I was under the influence. The person may justify it by saying that they've got their own physical or mental health problems. They believe it's the only way to control the elderly. Perhaps in some cases they think they're entitled. The research does not bear out an intergenerational transmission of violence as it does with child abuse, but there are certainly sizable numbers of cases where the child feels like they're entitled because of the way they were treated when they were younger, and sort of related to this, they believe the elder had it coming. They may even use the excuse, it's the only way I can keep her under control. It's the only way I can make sure she takes her medication. It's the only way I can get him to eat. So there's no lack of justifications on the part of the abusers. And then the opposite question, why do elders allow this abuse to happen? The number one reason given is fear of retaliation, fear that the abuser will actually lash out in a more harsh or more detrimental way. There's huge fear among many of these older community-dwelling elders of fear of being placed in a nursing home or becoming destitute. If I tell anybody, they'll think I can't take care of myself and they'll move me out. In some cases, religious beliefs dictate that you honor one's spouse in the case of these domestic violence situations. Perhaps mistrust of the police, allowing this to go on, thinking that nothing would change even if I did call the police. Self-blame, well, if I'd been a better parent to them when I was younger, when they were younger, perhaps they wouldn't be treating me this way now. If only I would remember to go to the bathroom in time, she wouldn't be hitting me. In other words, they can really, in their own minds, find a lot of reasons that they, sad to say, deserve to be abused. They may feel like it's futile to do anything, to try to do anything about it. This is often the case as well, that literally the elder is embarrassed about the abuse or the exploitation that's going on, or in fact, as we alluded to earlier, they may have diminished mental or physical capacity. So what about elder abuse and the law? Well, we have this slide simply to illustrate kind of an interesting but sad point, and that is historically, in terms of laws and social policy, we actually had early legislation that protected against cruelty to animals, and it was only some years later that we began to have various statutes in place that protected juveniles, or ultimately laws and policy that lent themselves to addressing the problem of child abuse. If we look just in rough terms across our history, then what we know is that the next large social issue to come into play and come to our attention was domestic violence, and then followed even most recently by elder abuse. So in terms of social problems that we've tried to legislate against, it's true that elder abuse has gotten increasing attention, but historically not nearly the kind of attention that these other types of abuse have gained. So current laws related to elder abuse, what we know is that all but 6 states actually have mandatory reporting requirements to Adult Protective Services. So you want to acquaint yourself with what the particular reporting requirements are in the state in which you live. Some states require that in some cases, persons making a report to APS must notify the police, so that if you call APS with suspected abuse or neglect of a neighbor, you're also expected to report that to law enforcement. It's often the case as well, that is typically supposed to be the case, that if APS suspects a crime, they too will notify law enforcement. Some states actually include increased penalties for those who victimize older persons. So a crime at one level, if it were against an assault, for example, if it were against a 40-year-old, is a more serious offense if it's against a 70-year-old. An increased emphasis on law enforcement, or by law enforcement I should say, and prosecutors on using both criminal and civil laws to bring abusers to justice. Again, much more attention to these issues than has ever been the case in the past. We give you this reference, the Elder Care Locator, which is one of the links within the National Center on Elder Abuse, because it provides a state-by-state breakdown about APS as well as elder resources and elder reporting requirements and so forth. So the American Bar Association has given us some very useful information related to Adult Protective Services. For those of you who are less acquainted with APS, basically they receive and investigate reports of suspected elder abuse, determine if protection is needed, and what a lot of law enforcement and people in general don't realize is that APS goal generally is to keep the elder in their own home if at all possible. It's not to remove them. And sometimes that has to be done, sometimes guardianship has to be taken, but that is not the original intent. They too are charged with determining if the elder has capacity to accept or refuse protective services, and then from there, depending on the person's needs, they can arrange for a variety of services, including those that we've listed here, including food delivery or health care or even home repair or cleaning. So mandatory reporting and recommendations that the American Bar Association has actually put forth. Some questions you can ask is, and this has to do with, should some legal process be taken if someone hasn't reported suspected abuse? The questions include, did failure to report the suspected elder abuse violate a state or a federal reporting requirement? Did this delay in reporting it result in further harm to the person? Did the failure or delay to report allow evidence to be lost? And then finally, is failure or delay in reporting evidence of a cover-up or a conspiracy of some kind? And if a report has not been made to APS at that point in time, it definitely needs to be. So what about consent? This is another area that is important for you to reckon with when you're talking about elder abuse, neglect, or exploitation. It means the decision to do something or to allow something to happen. And consent can be given multiple ways, including in writing or verbally or even in gestures. And generally, the person, if we're talking about in the cases of financial exploitation, the person must have had decision-making capacity, whatever the event, whether or not the person is thought to be able to have conducted that event, includes whether they have knowledge of what's been done and whether they have freely or voluntarily participated in it. So again, if a large sum of money has been suddenly made available to an adult child, were they able to even know what they were doing and that it did occur and they were willing to do it or not? And lack of valid consent may be an element of a crime. So it means this decision to allow something to happen. Decision-making capacity more specifically means the cognitive ability to make a decision from a legal standpoint, and this can fluctuate over time. Someone might have had that capacity, that decision-making capacity at one point, and then lose it later, perhaps because of extraordinary health or psychological difficulties. They've lost the decision-making capacity at one point in time, and then some months or years later, that may have been regained. So that must be determined to move forward with an investigation. Similarly, undue influence means simply using one's role to exploit the trust or the dependency or even the fear of that elder. So let's talk for a few minutes about detecting and investigating elder abuse. One of the things to start with is elders' fear of crime and their views of law enforcement. And research actually goes both ways. Some research tells us that older people are more fearful of crime, even though the statistics are that for crime in general, they have a much lower overall risk than the general population. We also know that obviously social support and their lifestyle play major roles both in whether they're fearful of crime as well as what they think about the police. And according to Rothman and Associates, elders Ambivalence regarding the police may stem from limited exposure, perhaps they've simply not ever interacted with police that much, or historical indifference by the police to the needs of this particular segment of the population. So what you see now, again, this is from the American Bar Association working in close conjunction with the National Center on Elder Abuse. These are extracted pages from what has recently been made available. It's called a pocket guide for law enforcement in the legal issues of elder abuse. So in each of these screens, the next few screens that you'll be seeing, on the right-hand side you see signs of physical abuse, and on the left-hand side what the ABA has done is actually list what could be some potential crimes that have occurred. And these are things to use as a go-by, if you will, for law enforcement when you're investigating possible abuse or neglect. So in the case of physical abuse, we can see some obvious signs would be causes for concern, causes for further investigation, including bruises and black eyes, bone fractures, certainly open wounds, including punctures or untreated injuries in various stages, broken eyeglasses, physical signs of being subjected to punishment, or signs of being restrained, tied down in some way. Are there findings from toxicology reports? Has the person been overdosed with their medication, or perhaps are they needing to use medication that they're not using? Diabetic, for example, would be a good example of that. An elder's report of being hit or slapped or kicked certainly is another sign that some abuse has, literally some physical abuse has happened. Also, if an elder suddenly changes their behavior, or if the caregiver, and this is one that law enforcement encounters on a somewhat regular basis, the caregiver's refusal to allow visitors to see an elder alone. So often this is a case where the caregiver and the elder have to be separated, not unlike domestic violence cases, so that the interrogation can move forward in a productive way. And as the American Bar Association points out, quite an array of possible crimes could have occurred in the case of physical, when you see these signs of physical abuse that deserve further investigation, all the way from assault to even worst case scenario to murder. Signs of emotional or psychological abuse, obviously if the elder is emotionally upset or agitated. By contrast, if they're extremely withdrawn and non-communicative or don't respond when you try to talk with them. Often behavior that might be attributed to dementia, behaviors like rocking back and forth and so forth, may be a sign of emotional or psychological abuse, as can an elder's report of being verbally or emotionally mistreated. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that sometimes they are willing to actually tell you that's precisely what's going on. And these could be indications of elder abuse, a variety of types, as well as harassment or even hate crimes. In terms of sexual abuse, obviously bruises around the breast or genital area, unexplained vaginal or anal bleeding, torn clothing, and once again an elder's report of being sexually assaulted or raped. We may be talking about possible criminal charges of assault or battery, possibly sexual assault. In some cases, elders are even caught up in trafficking. Financial or material exploitation covers a whole array of signs, including sudden changes in the bank account or banking practices of the older person, suddenly including additional names, other people's signatures on the elder's accounts, unauthorized withdrawal of the elder's funds using their ATM card. A classic example of this is you've got a grandchild who's your designated caregiver. They take your ATM card to the drugstore to get your prescriptions filled and to pay for those prescriptions, and that may be well and good, but while they're buying the prescriptions for you, they're also buying a number of items for themselves. And that might be a rather small level of this kind of offense, but it's an example of what we're talking about. Often, though, we're talking about literally wiping out the elder's complete account. If there's sudden changes in financial documents, sudden disappearance of certain funds, finding out obviously that the elder's signature is being forged, or suddenly relatives that were not involved in their financial affairs at all have become involved or are claiming some sort of rights to the elder's assets. All of these, and once again, as well as the elder themselves reporting what's going on, are telltale signs for law enforcement that financial or material exploitation may be occurring. Signs of neglect. Neglect is one of the tough issues in terms of documenting it, and we know that APS tells us that self-neglect, in fact, is a huge issue as well. But signs of neglect include dehydration, malnutrition, untreated bed sores that we talked about in part 1 of this program, hazardous or unsafe living conditions in general, including unsanitary and unclean conditions, insects, rodents, exorbitant numbers of dogs and cats, and so forth. And these could be crimes of elder abuse. In some cases, it would extend to the person dying, and the abuser or the perpetrator may actually be charged with manslaughter or murder, and at a minimum, charges of neglect may be brought. Self-neglect. Technically speaking, self-neglect is not a crime, but the reason that you in law enforcement want to be aware of it is because it can be an indicator or a result of some other type of abuse. So for example, financial exploitation by an abuser may leave the elder unable to heat their home, buy their food, pay for their medication, and so forth. And also the self-neglecting elder may be committing a crime themselves, such as hoarding animals, and that's how they first come to your attention, because something they're doing has actually brought the police out, where in fact, if we work backward or further into that investigation, we find out that self-neglect is much of what accounts for what you're discovering. Signs of abandonment. Obviously, the desertion of an elder at a hospital, a nursing facility, or a similar institution. We actually hear of cases where an elder is literally just left at one of those places. The desertion of them at a shopping center or another public location. And for most people, we can't imagine that, but for you in law enforcement, it shouldn't be a surprise that sometimes this actually happens with older persons. And again, if their own report to you is that they've been abandoned, then certainly investigation further is called for. And the crimes that may be committed in this case include elder abuse or manslaughter or murder, in other words, if the abandonment leads to their death, as well as neglect or negligent or involuntary homicide. So what seems serious enough can even be more serious in the aftermath. So what about the justice system and legal responses to elder abuse? Well, among the things that has been recommended by the National Center on Elder Abuse, and specifically in their Elder Justice Roadmap project, are that we should create law enforcement and prosecution units that specialize in elder abuse and enhance involvement of Medicaid fraud control units and state attorney general offices in these cases, such as those that involve abuse and neglect in long-term care. We also can make more concerted efforts to educate court personnel about the needs of elder abuse victims so that they can knowledgeably handle each of these cases and accommodate the person's needs. For example, if the elder needs to go to court to testify about something that's happened. And it's also recommended, of course, that we educate civil attorneys about the needs of elder abuse victims and their critical role in identifying and responding, because again, where suddenly relatives that have not been part of the picture show up or assert that they've got some legal rights, people perhaps exerting undue influence to be given power of attorney over the elder, those sorts of things are really domain civil attorneys who may be able to pinpoint when a problem is occurring. So some critical issues in prosecuting elder abuse cases. Obviously, law enforcement and prosecutors may need to obtain and use forms of evidence other than the victim's testimony, and this has to do with a Supreme Court case called Crawford v. Washington, and you'll want to learn more about that. There's also assessing the capacity to make past decisions will be critical in many of these cases, and even if capacity existed, a decision's invalid if it was not knowing and voluntarily made due to undue influence or fraud or coercion. So actions to consider include whether the alleged elder victim had capacity. Even if they have capacity now, is it retroactive? Did they have capacity at the time these agreements were made? And you shouldn't limit your investigation to the issue of capacity. Also consider the decisions that may have resulted, even if they have mental capacity, but decisions that they made that resulted from coercion or fraud or threats, all of which include not only the involvement of law enforcement, but also adult protective services. So finally, let's talk a little bit about interprofessional collaboration. One of the things that the National Center on Elder Abuse has recommended is that we remind our audience a variety of types of teams that are in practice so that law enforcement not only works with APS but also with other community agencies. And the forms that these teams take include, as we've listed here, traditional multidisciplinary teams, financial abuse specialist teams, fatality review teams, elder abuse forensic centers, elder abuse coalitions, consortia, or task forces. So in addition to exploring ways to strengthen cases for prosecution, law enforcement can work with a variety of social service providers or community sentinels, including elders themselves, I might add, and other local resources to protect the safety and the welfare of elders, as well as adults with disabilities. So teams typically are comprised of representatives from public agencies that investigate elder abuse, that is APS, but also often involve long-term care ombudsman, as well as law enforcement, of course, city or county council, and nonprofit, and sometimes for-profit agencies that provide services to community-dwelling seniors. And some examples we've given you here include working with Meals on Wheels or care management organizations or senior centers. All manner of victim services programs can assist individuals and families with navigating the criminal justice system and with advocacy, with crime victim compensation, intervention. So the roles that specifically law enforcement may play also include, lest we leave this out, a role in prevention. And by working with some of these organizations, or these multidisciplinary teams, I should say, their role can be more major. And one example of that is Triads, and the National Association of Triads is the overarching organization for this. But that's a group of 3 sectors of the community, for those who aren't already aware of them, that often work together. And the purpose of the 3 segments are actually public safety, criminal justice, and the older adult community themselves. And the purpose of these triads is to promote older adult safety and reduce the fear that older adults often experience. Once one is formed, then a group of representatives can implement a variety of programs to assist elders to be able to stay in their own homes with as little fear as possible and with as much heightened awareness of their risk as possible, so that ultimately their working with the community and with police is strengthened, and the opposite is true as well. So before we finish, we'd like to suggest some additional recommended training. This has obviously just been a snapshot of some of the basics of elder abuse for law enforcement, but certainly we invite you to learn more about the legal implications of the Crawford v. Washington Supreme Court case, as well as more about institutional abuse, about alcohol and drug abuse among the elderly and suicide, the elder driver, and the elder as crime perpetrator. And in the interest of time, we haven't included those in this particular segment, but they illustrate the fact that the variety of ways that you can increase your own training and professional development and ability to respond effectively to the older persons in your jurisdiction can be strengthened with additional knowledge. You can also learn more from the Houston Geriatric Education Center Video Education Library, and this is a list of some of the modules that are available for you in that library, and we encourage you to take advantage of any or all of these. as well as beyond the focus on elder abuse, professional law enforcement development at your own regional or state agencies. One example being the Bill Blackwood Law Enforcement Management Institute of Texas as just one example of where you can get this continued professional development. Thank you.